Hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take that chaotic mountain of complex source material, all the articles, the research, the investigative notes, and we really boil it down into those crucial, sparkling nuggets of insight that you need to be truly well-informed. We are so glad to have you with us today.
We really are. And today we're strapping in for an intense deep dive into the world of forensic science. We're focusing on two extraordinarily complex and I think emotionally challenging murder investigations.
Yeah, these are cases that, they collectively span decades. They feature killers who are successfully hiding in plain sight for far, far too long.
That's right. Our mission today is to unpack a really dense stack of sources that cover two very distinct, but you'll see, scientifically parallel scenarios.
On one hand, we're going to analyze the decades-long sprawling search for the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. This is a figure so elusive his crimes went cold for, nearly 20 years.
And then we're going to pivot, pretty dramatically, to a very tightly focused, high-stakes hunt in the, shimmering heat of Las Vegas. This was a search for a killer motivated purely by greed.
Right, someone who tried to just incinerate their crime, only to be undone by a microscopic piece of specialized trace evidence and a highly unusual murder weapon found at the bottom of a lake.
It's incredible. Our goal is to illustrate how the astonishing, just relentless evolution of forensic science, we're talking specifically the progression of DNA technology and the microscopic power of trace evidence, became this unstoppable force.
Yeah. A force that finally brought both of these very different killers to justice, completely, transcending their meticulously planned efforts to conceal the truth.
It really is a powerful narrative of police persistence meeting scientific genius. And these cases prove that if you wait long enough and you protect that evidence, the science will catch up to the lie.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to begin with the investigation that really defined an era in Washington state law enforcement, the challenging, heartbreaking hunt for the Green River Killer.
To really set the scene, you have to transport yourself back to Kent, Washington. It's the summer of 1982.
And this is an area about, 30 miles south of Seattle?
Exactly. And the Green River itself, it's not some violent waterway. It's actually a slow, pretty meandering river that flows through the South Seattle Valley.
So a quiet place, almost pastoral.
At the time, yes. A place where people went to raft and relax. And that tranquility was just violently shattered.
The date was August 15th, 1982. And the lead detective on this case, a man who would dedicate 20 years of his life to this saga, he got the call that would change everything.
Yeah, a rafter was on the river and saw what he initially mistook for large, discarded mannequins pushed up along the riverbank.
And right here at the very beginning, the investigation yielded a crucial and I think easily overlooked detail.
It really did.
Yeah.
The rafter noticed a white male standing nearby. This man quickly got into a pickup truck, waved, and then just drove off hastily.
It wasn't until the rafter got closer that he understood the horrifying reality. These were not mannequins.
No, they were dead human bodies.
The account from the investigators who responded is just incredibly haunting. It paints a picture that captures the tragedy and the absolute vulnerability of these victims.
They described one victim where the water flow had freed one of her hands and her arm, and as the river gently shifted, the hand was literally waving in the current.
Wow.
Sort of like, here I am, help.
That is a devastating image, and it instantly establishes the emotional stakes here.
Absolutely. Initially, they found 3 victims. Opal Mills, who was discovered on the bank, and then Cynthia Hines and Maria Chapman recovered from the water itself.
And the autopsies quickly revealed something important.
Yes. 2 of these victims contained bodily fluids that were left behind, indicating a sexual encounter had taken place.
And this detail immediately threw up the largest technological barrier of the era. We're in 1982.
Right. DNA analysis as we know it today was basically science fiction. You couldn't analyze samples for a unique genetic profile.
So the most they could hope for was, just rudimentary blood typing?
That's it. Which can only exclude certain suspects. It can't definitively identify the killer.
But they knew enough to save it.
They did. Recognizing the potential value, even if they didn't know how that value would be extracted, the investigators meticulously collected every single biological sample, the fluids, the swabs, the hairs, and they froze them for a potential future breakthrough.
That single decision, made really out of sheer faith in science, became the anchor for the entire case years later.
It really did. They identified the victims through the few records they had, Fingerprints, dental records, and the scope of the horror just immediately expanded.
Because before these river discoveries, they were already looking at the death of 16-year-old Leanne Wilcox in January and Wendy Caulfield in July.
And then Debbie Bonner was found on August 12th, right before the three found on the 15th.
Oh.
Suddenly, they're looking at 6 dead bodies in rapid succession.
And the connection was chillingly uniform.
All of the victims had been strangled, but the second, and I think heartbreaking, common denominator was their lifestyle.
These were incredibly vulnerable young girls.
Extraordinarily vulnerable, often just 15 or 16 years old. Many had run away from severely dysfunctional or abusive homes and had unfortunately ended up on the street working in prostitution on what they called the strip.
And there was even a personal connection, right? One of the investigators knew one of the victims.
Yes, Maura Chapman. One of the investigators had previously tried to help her after an assault. So that sense of failure and frustration, knowing these were young lives, that society had already failed, it just deepened the commitment of the task force.
The immediate reality that hit the police force was undeniable.
All these young women were likely killed by the same person. They were certain they had a serial murderer on their hands, so they established a task force of about 20 to 25 detectives.
And that immediate realization made the case uniquely difficult. Because the vast majority of serial homicides are what they call stranger homicides.
Exactly. There's no pre-existing connection, no family link, no shared workplace, no relationship that an investigator can trace back to the killer.
The victim and the killer come together for the first time, and for the victim, it's the last time. That anonymity is precisely what makes these cases so cold.
And it's why that forensic evidence collection, even the stuff they couldn't analyze back in 1982, was absolutely paramount.
So when you're dealing with an active serial killer, especially one who's escalating, there has to be this constant, terrifying pressure hanging over the investigation.
Oh, absolutely. The historical precedent shows that unless these killers are incarcerated or dead, they don't stop.
The anxiety of knowing that every single day you might find another body, it must create an atmosphere of just, desperation.
It does. And it pushes investigators to consider every possible avenue. So they reached out to the FBI Behavioral Science Center in Quantico, Virginia, for profiling assistance.
And what did the profile suggest?
That the killer might exhibit psychopathic tendencies, and that often such individuals are drawn back to the scene or even the investigation. They might even call in, offering to help, just to get close and see what the police know.
And that expectation, it materialized almost immediately.
It did. A man named Melvin Foster contacted the sheriff's office, insisting he knew some of the victims and could offer help to the task force.
Foster immediately raised all sorts of red flags.
A ton of them. He was a cab driver, which meant his job kept him constantly out and about in the exact areas where these young women were working or going missing.
So they bring him in.
They bring him in, find he has outstanding warrants, and given his suspicious proximity, they ask him to submit to a polygraph test.
Let's talk about the polygraph here, because its limitations really had a critical impact on this case early on.
They really did. As we know, the polygraph device measures physiological responses.
Okay.
Heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductance, respiration. The whole idea is that lying creates measurable anxiety or stress in a normal person.
And Melvin Foster, he failed that polygraph test. By all accounts, he failed it badly.
He did, and that fueled a significant resource sink for the investigation.
But this is where the science runs up against legal reality, right?
Exactly. Even with a failed polygraph, and after extensive surveillance and a meticulous search of his house, where they did find some questionable photos, they found zero physical evidence linking him to the bodies.
No fibers, no hairs, no fingerprints, nothing.
Nothing. A failed polygraph is legally insufficient for an arrest. So he became this major red herring, consuming time and resources the investigation just couldn't afford to lose.
And this lack of progress, coupled with the ever-increasing body count, it led to just immense frustration.
It did. By late 1982 and certainly into 1983, the task force suffered severe cutbacks. It was eventually downsized to just 2 dedicated detectives.
Wow, from 25 down to 2.
And this is where the emotional and public pain of the case just peaked. The detectives were working relentlessly, but they faced crushing public criticism. The families of the victims were furious disappointed.
And they felt the police didn't care about their daughters.
Yes, and the investigators were dealing with this cruel internal realization that while the immediate families were suffering deeply, the wider community held a profound apathy.
The sources reveal that the harsh reality was, and this is a quote, the other part of the community didn't really care because the victims were marginalized. They were prostitutes, runaways, vulnerable young people.
Which made fundraising, resource allocation, and maintaining any kind of momentum incredibly difficult.
And compounding all of this, the killer just did not stop.
Not at all. By late 1983, they had 13 confirmed victims. By 1984, that number had surged to 21, and the list of missing girls just kept growing.
The nature of the work must have shifted completely.
It did. It went from an active investigation focusing on leads to this grim, exhausting task of just recovering skeletal remains day after day, week after week. It was soul-crushing work, with estimates of the total missing count climbing towards 60, 70, or even 80 young women.
So after years of just drowning in thousands of leads and what must have been endless paperwork, the investigation finally benefited from a technological aid around 1985. They got a computer.
And this was revolutionary for a case of this magnitude. This new technology allowed the detectives to centralize and organize the vast, chaotic amount of evidence they'd gathered over the years.
And once they organized the data, something started to stand out.
A very specific detail began to surface repeatedly. The sighting of a greenish-colored pickup truck. It was seen either in the area of the disappearances or, in some cases, directly with a victim.
And this vehicle clue was solidified by a key witness named Paige Miley.
That's right. Paige had been working on the strip with her friend, Kim Nelson. Paige was picked up, returned a short time later, and found Kim gone. Days later, the same man in the same pickup truck approached Paige again and pointedly asked where her tall friend was.
Chilling.
That suspicion gave investigators enough traction to put 6 photographs in front of Paige. And she immediately identified one man, Gary Ridgway.
Ridgway's profile looked interesting from the start.
It did. He lived in the neighborhood just off the strip, making him physically proximate to the victims. Yet he was described universally as meek, mild-mannered, giving people the immediate impression that he was harmless, incapable of violence.
But he did have a prior arrest.
A minor one for patronizing a prostitute. He also worked as a painter at Kenworth Trucking, a manufacturing plant in Renton, which was about 40 minutes from his home.
And the investigative team made a crucial finding by cross-referencing their murder timelines with his work records.
This was huge. They discovered a definite spike in the number of murder cases when there was a strike at Kenworth. When the plant wasn't operating, Ridgway was off work.
Which gave him 24-hour access to the women on the strip.
Exactly. He became their prime suspect. They immediately got a search warrant for his home, applying that core forensic principle, the cards exchange principle. Every contact leaves a trace.
Right. They would have been meticulously collecting samples, knowing they needed to link him forensically to the victims.
Oh, absolutely. They gathered stray hairs, carpet samples, specific fibers, even paid samples from his work coveralls. They accumulated a vast body of material evidence that, again, would take years to analyze with the tech they had in the late 80s.
So they had motive, opportunity, location, and a witness ID. In 1987, they brought Ridgway in and decided to give him the polygraph tests.
And given how badly Melvin Foster had failed, they must have been pretty confident this piece of technology would finally confirm their suspicion.
And this is maybe the most terrifying twist of this whole early investigation.
It is. Gary Ridgway, the primary suspect who was geographically and temporally linked to the victims, passed the polygraph test.
Wait, let me just stop you there. This man, who would later confess to dozens of murders, passed the test designed to catch measurable anxiety when lying. That's an absolute failure of the science as it was understood then.
It speaks volumes about the fallibility of the polygraph. It reinforced the reality that this instrument is just not foolproof.
So individuals, especially psychopaths or people comfortable with severe deception, can control their physiological responses.
That's the theory. If they're relaxed, if they truly believe their own lie or simply don't experience anxiety about their actions, the polygraph shows no measurable spike in heart rate or change in skin conductance. Ridgway appeared calm, relaxed, and truthful.
Which must have been incredibly frustrating for the police.
Unbelievably so. So they had to release him. But they did manage to get one thing before he left in 1987.
The saliva sample.
Yes. They asked him to chew on a gauze pad, which collected a saliva sample. That gauze was meticulously labeled and frozen. In the 80s, the only thing they could determine from that was his blood type. That's it.
So it was collected on a hunch, a piece of due diligence with no immediate scientific value at all.
None. And for the next decade, the case stalled. The material collected from Ridgway's house was analyzed, but nothing created that definitive link needed for a charge. The task force downsized again, the case went cold, and the killer just faded back into the anonymity of his meek life.
The case may have been cold, but it was never truly closed.
Never. The lead detective, who had dedicated years of his life to finding the Green River killer, he actually became the King County Sheriff in 1997.
And as soon as he was sworn in, he immediately reopened the investigation. He instructed that all evidence, particularly those early frozen samples, be thoroughly reviewed. He was basically betting on a scientific miracle.
He was. And this is where we see the extraordinary arc of DNA technology. Initially, those fragile, decades-old samples, the 1987 saliva and the 1982 spermatozoa, were sent to labs back east.
But they were deemed too fragile and so minute for the technology at the time.
Exactly. The labs wisely advised that they could be destroyed if they tried to analyze them then. The investigators were told to wait.
And then the technology they had been waiting for finally arrived. We're in 2001.
Yes. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab adopted STR-PCR technologies. Short tandem repeat polymerase chain reaction. This was the true forensic breakthrough that was needed for this case.
For our well-informed listeners, let's just unpack PCR a little more fully. What made this shift so revolutionary in this context?
Well, before STR-PCR, labs needed a large, relatively pure sample like, think of visible bloodstain. PCR technology, especially the STR application, is often described as a molecular Xerox machine.
So it can make copies.
Millions of them. It allows scientists to take incredibly small, even partially degraded amounts of DNA, just a whisper of genetic material, and copy specific, highly variable regions of that DNA over and over again. They amplify it until they have a shout loud enough to generate a full, conclusive genetic profile.
Which made the minimal samples they had stored for all those years finally viable.
Exactly. This was the last chance for that original critical evidence collected back in 1982. They focused on the old autopsy swabs.
And despite the samples being nearly 2 decades old and stored under, let's say, less than ideal conditions,
the lab successfully generated a clear male profile from the limited sperm found on the autopsy swabs of the 2 initial victims, Opal Mills and Maria Chapman. And they generated the identical profile from a 3rd separate victim as well.
So they had the genetic fingerprint of the Green River killer, but they still didn't have his name. This is the moment that 1987 frozen gauze, collected almost pointlessly years earlier, came back into play.
As the critical reference sample, they ran all the reference samples collected from past suspects through the new technology. One sample matched the evidence profile perfectly.
The call came into the sheriff's office.
Yep. The investigator was shown 3 identical DNA charts, one for Opal Mills, one for Maria Chapman, and the 3rd labeled the Green River Killer.
And when the sheriff asked, "Is this it? Do we finally know who it is?" the lab tech pulled out the envelope containing the name of the suspect whose saliva had provided the match.
Gary Ridgway. That moment was described as one of profound, just life-altering relief. Finally, after decades of doubt, frustration, and heartache.
Finally, we know who it is. So Ridgway was arrested in 2001, but the defense immediately launched a very strategic counterargument. They sought to neutralize the DNA evidence.
Right. They couldn't deny his presence, but they argued that since Ridgway frequented prostitutes, the DNA only proved he was a customer sometime before her death, not that he was the killer himself.
And that defense, if it was left unchallenged, it had a slim chance of introducing reasonable doubt.
It did. The investigators knew they needed a forensic link that was completely independent of the sexual encounter, something that placed Ridgway with the victims at the time of their death, linking him specifically to his mundane, non-sexual daily life.
And this required the secondary, incredible forensic coup of the case, the trace evidence eureka moment that sealed it.
Right. They brought in a microscopic analysis lab to look at the clothing of the badly preserved victims.
The clothing must have been in terrible shape, recovered from the elements.
It was. And as they vacuumed and sifted dust and debris from the fabric, they started noticing something strange across multiple victims' clothing. Tiny colored spheres of spray paint.
Why would 6 different prostitutes, all killed and dumped separately, have spray paint on their clothes?
Exactly the question. And they didn't just look at the color. They utilized high-quality infrared microspectrophotometry. It's a technique that essentially gets the highly specific chemical signature of a compound.
And what signature did those microscopic spheres reveal?
They were identified as Imran paint. And this is not your standard house paint or car repair paint. It was described as a very unusual paint based on its infrared spectrum.
Imran is known for its incredible chemical resistance, durability. It's an industrial paint.
A very specific one. And crucially, Imran paint was the specific type used at the Kenworth truck factory, where Gary Ridgway worked as a painter.
But wait, if he worked there, couldn't that trace evidence have just transferred to him or his vehicle in a non-criminal context? What makes this specific trace evidence irrefutable?
That's the critical analysis. The paint was found embedded deep into the fabric of the victim's clothes, consistent with close physical contact. And because Ridgway was a painter at Kenworth, he was covered in this specific chemical.
It demonstrated that the victims had been in close physical contact with Ridgway or his specific work environment, not just, casually passing by a Kenworth truck.
Exactly. It was the physical evidence needed to argue he was with them when they died, and it completely collapsed the defense's customer argument.
So with 7 counts of murder now firmly tied to Ridgway via irrefutable DNA and this very specific trace evidence, the prosecution had an incredibly strong case. But in 2003, a key strategic decision was made regarding the potential death penalty.
Right. Rumors began circulating that the defense would trade a full, comprehensive confession, including locating all the missing bodies, for taking the death penalty off the table.
Which, while negotiating with a confessed monster is ethically fraught, the police leadership saw this as immensely beneficial for the community.
And most importantly, for the countless families who still had missing daughters, this was really the only chance to give those families some kind of resolution.
So discussions began, and Ridgway eventually agreed to confess. He admitted guilt to about 65 murders and agreed to show investigators precisely where other bodies were located.
And what followed were these deeply surreal, dark road trips with Ridgway. He guided the detectives through the county years later, directing them precisely to body dump sites.
One detective described focusing on the Mary West case and watching as Ridgway, without a single wrong turn, directed the driver exactly down the right roads, right to the precise spot where he had dragged her body years earlier.
The terrifying, almost pathological memory required to recall the precise spot of dozens of crimes years later. It just speaks volumes about the premeditation, the calculation, and the total lack of remorse involved.
And when they interviewed him for hours about his motive,
he confessed chillingly that he just hated women and felt they were vulnerable. He said it felt good to kill a woman, and that interviewing him was like looking into the eyes of pure evil.
He pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder. And the sentencing that followed was one of the most intensely emotional courtroom scenes in U.S. history. It was held in a jam-packed courthouse.
Families were finally given the opportunity to read their statements describing the immense pain and loss. And the investigators, they described seeing an incredible, humbling demonstration of faith in that room.
Some families, despite their decades of suffering, stood up and said, "I forgive you, sir. I forgive you for killing my daughter."
A profound moment of human courage and belief in the face of just unimaginable evil.
The case was heartbreaking, but the final resolution provided a sense of relief and satisfaction that he was held accountable.
But as one investigator pointed out, the ultimate legacy remains the enduring pain for the families, which will never, ever go away. Justice was delivered, however, through the relentless patience of the police and the crucial evolution of forensic science they relied upon.
That investigation is really a masterclass in forensic endurance. It demonstrates how decades of patient waiting can be rewarded by a single, powerful scientific breakthrough. Now let's pivot dramatically to a case where the killer didn't operate across decades, but focused ruthlessly on a single target, motivated by pure, cold greed.
And we'll see how hyper-specific modern forensic science cracked that case in a fraction of the time.
Exactly. We move now to the stark landscape outside of Las Vegas. This case is a classic tale of wealth, power, and revenge played out among the city's affluent residents.
Yeah, the investigation began when a group of fishermen, scouting a remote area outside the city limits, noticed a suspicious, thoroughly charred section of the desert floor. It looked like an old, massive campfire.
And inside that charred area, they found the outlines and severely damaged remains of what was clearly an antique piece of furniture, specifically a distinct, large, humpback trunk.
The evidence recovered was gruesome. There were small human remains, including foot and finger bones, and oddly, about 15 feet away from the pit, a perfectly intact human skull.
And chillingly, The first responders could immediately see small caliber bullet holes visible on the skull itself.
And right next to the skull was the specific detail that immediately pointed investigators toward the victim's identity. A gold bracelet encrusted with diamonds spelling the name R-O-N.
Ron Rudin. He'd been reported as a mysterious missing person for about 4 weeks. He was wealthy, well-known, a successful real estate developer in Las Vegas.
So while the bracelet strongly suggested the identity, police needed scientific proof. And this is where forensic science provided the initial confirmation. Fire cannot burn teeth.
Right, they require extreme temperatures, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit or more to disintegrate?
Exactly. So since the teeth were still in the skull, the medical examiner used dental records to confirm the identity. These were the remains of Ron Rudin. They now had an officially confirmed murder case.
And the gruesome details only escalated from there.
They did. The medical examiner found evidence of 5 small caliber bullet holes in the skull, but a forensic anthropologist examining the bones made the most disturbing observation.
Looking closely at the vertebrae where the neck connects to the skull.
They observed specific clean knife marks. This suggested that decapitation had occurred before the fire was started.
Wow. That's a clear indication of immense rage and calculated effort.
It is. Someone had shot the poor man multiple times, decapitated him with a sharp instrument, stuffed him into this custom-made humpback trunk, and then set the whole thing alight in a remote area, believing they had incinerated all the evidence.
And investigators even managed to reconstruct the trunk's appearance from small surviving pieces, right?
They did. It was blue on the outside and had a distinct wallpaper lining the inside.
So, just like in the Green River case, investigators immediately established a victimology for Ron Rudin. And they quickly realized there was a huge chasm between the public Ron Rudin and the private Ron Rudin.
Oh, a vast one. Publicly, he was the image of success. A multimillionaire, a respected real estate developer, a workaholic.
Privately, however, he was a self-confessed playboy, described as ruthlessly unfaithful to all of his wives and known for a volatile temper.
And Rudin generated a lot of ill will through his business practices. He would personally finance homes, but if a payment was even 1 day late, he was ruthless and would immediately foreclose.
So he left a lot of former business associates and clients with intense anger toward him. Some investigators even noted that locals felt his gruesome death was, poetic justice.
There was also the bizarre element of his personal security and habits. The outline mentions his belief in carrying a gun in his boot and that he had converted an entire walk-in closet into a literal gun safe,
housing over 500 different weapons. This speaks to a man who lived in a state of high awareness, expecting potential threats.
And then there was the immediate red herring of the mob. Rudin's distinct black Cadillac was found parked in the employee-only back alley of the Crazy Horse Topless Bar, a location known to be owned by organized crime.
So initial theories immediately focused on a mob hit.
Right, but investigators quickly dismissed this angle. Rudin had no competing mob business, and as one detective pointed out, if the mob had killed him, they are certainly not going to put a key piece of evidence in one of their clubs.
So they figured it was a poor attempt to throw us off by someone who knew the Vegas dynamics.
Exactly. The focus rapidly shifted inward to Margaret Rudin, his 5th wife. It was immediately apparent that she had married Ron for his substantial estimated $13 million wealth.
And the marriage was volatile.
Extremely. Their history included constant fighting, a reported domestic violence incident where shots were fired, and Ron had previously suspected Margaret of stealing one of his guns from his massive collection.
The financial motive was overwhelming and immediate.
It was. Ron was actively changing his will to drastically reduce Margaret's inheritance. And Margaret, meanwhile, had been wiretapping his office and phones, so she was acutely aware of his infidelity and his financial maneuvers to cut her out.
And the tipping point seemed to occur just before his disappearance.
It did. Ron cut off her financial allowance for her failing antique store, he disabled her cell phone, and he turned in the Lincoln Continental she was leasing.
So Margaret's financial control, her cash cow, was visibly drying up and quickly.
And her behavior after his disappearance set off massive red flags for law enforcement. She delayed reporting him missing for several days, claiming Ron does this all the time.
And when investigators finally confronted her with the news that Ron had been found murdered, her reaction was purely performative.
Purely. She immediately asked about his life insurance policy, her main source of future wealth. And then, under questioning, she began digging her first knuckle into her eye, desperately trying to fake tears.
She wasn't genuinely upset. She was presenting a calculated performance.
Absolutely. And before the detectives could even return to the station, she had lawyered up. shutting down all communication.
So Margaret was clearly the prime suspect, given the motive and the deception, but the police needed hard physical evidence to tie her directly to the act.
And that evidence finally arrived when a young man named Augustin Lovato contacted the police.
Lovato was the young man Margaret had hired to clean the couple's master bedroom after Ron, she claimed, had suffered a bloody nose.
Right. And Lovato described finding a massive, shocking pool of blood soaking the entire top half of the mattress and the carpet beneath the bed. He noted the blood was stinky and nasty, far beyond a simple nosebleed.
Critically, Lovato also recalled seeing little droplets of blood on the picture above the headboard, a detail that is utterly inconsistent with the nosebleed.
He then told investigators where he had disposed of the mattress, allowing them to recover it, still covered in Ron's blood.
Based on Lovato's testimony, they executed a search warrant on the house. And to prove a large-scale violent crime had occurred there, despite the wife's cleaning efforts, they used luminol.
And for an informed audience, the key takeaway about luminol here isn't the chemistry. It's the forensic challenge it overcame. Luminol reacts with blood's iron content, making even invisible traces fluoresce blue.
So by spraying the chemical in the master bedroom, they were challenging her meticulous cleanup attempt.
And the results were dramatic. The wall above the bed lit up like the Milky Way, just glowing with evidence of massive amounts of blood that someone had attempted and failed to scrub away completely.
And the blood spatter pattern confirmed Lovato's suspicion.
It did. It was identified as high-velocity mist, a pattern typically only consistent with a bullet entering the skull, where the extreme pressure forces microscopic blood droplets outward from existing openings.
They even found bits of brain matter still left on the ceiling, proving the shooting happened right there.
So this was conclusive proof a murder had occurred in that room. But a major complication immediately arose.
Right. Ron's third wife had committed suicide years earlier on that same bed by shooting herself in the head. Her blood spray was also still present on the wall.
So investigators were faced with a classic forensic nightmare. They needed to differentiate the DNA profiles, Ron's, his ex-wife's, and potentially the killer's, from a shared, compromised crime scene.
They needed an absolutely irrefutable reference DNA profile for Ron Rudin.
Their only initial source was a handkerchief found on Ron's side of the sink, used to dab himself when shaving. But a good defense attorney would argue, how do you know that was definitively Ron's blood? It could have been anyone.
This led to the second major forensic breakthrough of this case, an innovative use of the victim's remains.
They went back to Ron Rudin's skull. Inside the structure of a tooth is the nutrient center called the pulp.
And the pulp is protected by the dense enamel and dentin surrounding it, which makes it essentially fireproof. It acts as a perfect shield for rich, intact DNA.
Exactly. By meticulously extracting the pulp from the teeth in the recovered skull, the investigators successfully generated Ron Rudin's irrefutable DNA profile. This allowed them to definitively match the blood on the mattress, the ceiling, and the wall to the DNA from the skull.
And this technique, using tooth pulp DNA for positive identification in a homicide trial, was a groundbreaking use in a Las Vegas court at the time.
It really was.
So with the DNA evidence confirming Ron was killed in the bedroom, the case against Margaret became overwhelming, but it was still circumstantial. The motive, the cleanup, the confirmed murder location, it all pointed to her, but they were still missing that final hard link.
And the first of those final pieces was found in Margaret's own meticulously organized files. A receipt for a humpback trunk.
The receipt detailed the exact dimensions, and the description included the wallpaper interior, perfectly matching the burnt remains found in the desert.
The furniture dealer even remembered selling the custom piece to the nice lady from Las Vegas.
But the grand jury initially thought the case, despite this mountain of circumstantial evidence, wasn't quite enough to proceed to trial without the murder weapon.
Right. The 5 small caliber bullet fragments recovered from Ron's skull were heavily damaged and initially dismissed by the forensic pathologist as too damaged to be compared.
But the diligent pathologist took a crucial second look.
He did. He realized the coarse, unusual marks visible on the bullets might not be damaged from impacting the bone, but rather unique marks caused by a suppressor or silencer attached to the weapon. A silencer often introduces unique rifling marks.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The pathologist, connecting dots across the entire department, remembered an entirely unrelated gun found 3 years earlier in 1996 in Lake Mead.
A scuba diver had found a white plastic bag at the bottom of the lake containing a heavily suppressed .22 semi-automatic pistol.
This gun had been cleaned, test-fired, and stored in the evidence vault for years, listed merely as an unclaimed weapon. When they retrieved it, they realized the suppressor component aligned perfectly with the course marks on the fragments from Ron Ruden's head.
So they test-fired the weapon again, comparing the marks left on the test bullets to the fragments from Ruden's skull.
And the microscopic analysis resulted in an irrefutable ballistic match. This was the smoking gun.
And the final decisive link.
The ATF traced the gun's serial number. The suppressed .22 semi-automatic pistol found at the bottom of Lake Mead had belonged to Ron Ruden. It had disappeared from his massive walk-in gun safe shortly after Margaret came into the picture.
The only person who would be in the man's bedroom at 2 a.m. with his own suppressed weapon, with an overwhelming financial motive, was Margaret Ruden.
Absolutely. The grand jury reconvened, and this overwhelming convergence of evidence, the ballistics, the tooth pulp DNA, the trunk receipt, secured a true bill, or an indictment against her.
And knowing the game was up, Margaret immediately disappeared.
Off the face of the earth. She used wigs and hair dye, successfully concealing her identity for nearly 2 years, moving from Arizona down into Mexico, relying on a tiny, tight network of trusted friends.
Her location was eventually revealed after an informant tipped off the FBI that she was living in a quiet suburb of Boston, Massachusetts called Revere.
And the police executed what was described as a classic piece of undercover work, sick and whistle 101. They saw a pizza delivery guy go to her apartment. They stopped him, quickly donned the uniform, and knocked on her door.
And when she answered, they simply asked, "Margaret, do you know why we're here?"
And her first instantly incriminating words, it's meant that Vegas thing, the facade of her quiet new life just dissolved instantly.
She was brought back and, after a month-long trial, was convicted, receiving 20 to life.
The case was won not just by persistence, but by the convergence of cutting-edge forensic science, the preservation and identification via tooth pulp DNA, and the diligence required to connect those unique ballistic markings to Ron's own suppressed gun.
It's a profound, tragic story, but a classic one of greed, power, money, revenge, resulting in Ron being killed by one of his own weapons. The man who lived by the sword and meticulously protected himself was ultimately undone by his vulnerability to the person he trusted most.
As we draw a breath and reflect on these two intense investigations, the 20-year endurance test of the Green River Killer and the hyper-specific, targeted pursuit of Margaret Ruden, we see two clear, compelling parallel themes emerge from the source materials.
Absolutely. The first theme is the critical, almost miraculous arc of scientific evolution and the patience required to wait for it. In the Ridgway case, the progression from basic blood typing in 1982 to the powerful STR-PCR technology in 2001 meant that decades-old, minimal, and fragile samples could finally be weaponized to secure a conviction.
They preserved a whisper of DNA, and the science eventually allowed it to shout the truth.
Exactly. And in the Ruden case, we saw the precise application of specialized forensics in a condensed time frame. They used luminol to defeat the killer's meticulous cleaning effort, establishing the crime scene definitively.
And then they deployed the revolutionary, fireproof quality of tooth pulp DNA to establish the victim's identity against a skeptical defense. Even the ballistics required a highly trained eye to connect the course marks on a damaged bullet to the specific mechanism of a suppressor.
The second, equally powerful parallel is the sheer importance of tireless, dedicated police work. In both scenarios, investigators were faced with overwhelming systemic setbacks, failed polygraphs, community apathy toward victims, endless false leads, and years of crippling frustration.
Yet they kept those cold case files open. They waited patiently, trusting that the science eventually would catch up to the truth that the perpetrators worked so hard to conceal.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The ability to solve these cold cases underscores how modern science can utterly transcend the time, effort, and malice killers exert to hide their crimes.
It reinforces that even in the face of complex deception like trying to burn a body in a custom trunk or hiding a gun at the bottom of a vast lake, tiny, almost imperceptible details hold the entire truth. A trace of industrial Imron paint, a specific bullet mark, a fragment of DNA protected inside a tooth.
It really is an enduring lesson in the persistence required for justice.
And here's the final thought for you to explore. In both cases, the convicted killers, Gary Ridgway and Margaret Ruden, lived outwardly quiet or respected lives while engaging in monstrous calculated acts. Ridgway was the meek, mild-mannered truck painter. Ruden was the respectable, wealth-seeking socialite. This raises a sobering question. If the science hadn't evolved to pinpoint their guilt with such irrefutable physical evidence, would we ever truly know who lives right next door, hiding behind a mask of chilling normalcy? Something for you to mull over.
Thank you for joining us on this intense deep dive into forensics and deception. If you enjoyed unpacking these complex sources and learning about the scientific breakthroughs that crack these monumental cases, please make sure to subscribe to the Deep Dive channel so you don't miss our next exploration. We appreciate